بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ولولا أن يكون الناس أمة واحدة لجعلنا لمن يكفر بالرحمن لبيوتهم سقفا من فضة ومعارج عليها يظهرون.
Assalamu alaikum everyone, and welcome to the Ummah Times podcast show, where we help decolonize minds. And today on the show, we'll be talking about a very interesting topic, which is economics in Islam, which is a topic that is not talked much in the public sphere. And today we have a packed house in the studio, starting with Brother Malik, who heads his personal project site, freshonomics.org, where you can find writings on the Islamic economic system at his site. We also have Brother Ali from the Ummah Times, who's actually an author of the paper What is Money, which is published by the Ummah Times. We also have our good friend Brother Khurram, who will be posing some very interesting questions to the panelists on economics in Islam. And you have myself, Zishan, the co-host of the Ummah Times. Assalamu alaikum, brothers. How are you brothers doing?
Very well. Jazakallah for the invite.
No problem. I'm gonna, without further ado, I'm gonna get kind of right into the discussion. And recently there was an article that was published, I believe last month, by the CBC, and the headline of the article talked about how the world's richest 2,000 people hold more than what the poorest own, 4.6 billion combined. This was reported by Oxfam. And we know this trend for a long time, where only a minority of people in the world own more than half of what the poorest population of the planet own. And this is a result of what we know of capitalism, which we've been subject to, the whole world has been subject to for quite a while. Brother Malik, I want to ask you is that does Islam, does it offer an alternative to the present system, economic system that we're subject to? If you can kind of elaborate on some of that.
Yeah, Jazakallah, Brother Zishan. So, absolutely, Islam does offer a comprehensive alternative to the capitalist economic system as well as the communist systems. Islam is a way of life that was revealed to our beloved messenger, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and so it comes to answer all questions, right, about how we should live. And we know this from a detailed point of view, from a very practical point of view. We know that Islam had methods of how to organize the economy. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam spoke to a number of issues when it came to on how to organize the wealth of society, what types of taxes we should collect, and as well as what kind of transactions are legal and what are not legal. So, for example, when he was asked about, when prices were skyrocketing, they were asked him about fixing prices, and he forbade that. So he said that Allah is the one that decides the prices. So it's forbidden for fixing prices. But at the same time, when it comes to mineral wealth, when he was in one narration, he was giving away a piece of land. When he was alerted that piece of land had a salt mine effectively in it. If you read the wording of the hadith, it had a salt mine in it. And so he took it back, because according to the ijtihad, when it comes to mineral wealth, that is commonly owned, which is a unique kind of wealth class within Islam. So it's not neither state ownership nor private ownership, which means that the Khalifa of the Islamic State must use that wealth to the benefit of the Ummah. So gold, silver, any type of mineral wealth will have to be used for the benefit of the Ummah. And then you can take the Khalifa to court if he's not using it according to the benefit of the Ummah. For watching the debacle that is the impeachment in the US, we can see that it's not just these things not just economics, and Islam doesn't stand on its own. There's also a whole political system around it, which speaks to how we have checks and balances.
Yeah.
And speaking to that report, I think that's one of the key things that we need to highlight when it comes to that, is that what the issue is that people know that with the experiment of communism, that this idea of having just like a numerical equality was not something that really worked, primarily because it's not from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When a man comes up with a system, it's doomed to fail. But what Islam does is that there were rich and poor Sahaba, right?
Yeah.
So Abdurrahman bin Auf, may Allah be pleased with him, was very wealthy, but Musab bin Umair was very poor, right? Musab bin Umair, may Allah be pleased with him, when he passed away, there was not enough clothes to bury his blessed body, right? And so they ordered that leaves be Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam ordered that leaves be put on his blessed body to cover that part which the cloth would not cover. But at the same time, Abdurrahman bin Auf was very wealthy, right? And what was pointed out in that report was that the problem is that what is the fair system, right? And this is the central issue. When it comes down to it, the only way you can have a fair system, if it comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you and I, even if the people here in this room were to come up with a system as human beings and were to sit down, it would cause injustice because we're limited people, right? Whereas what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has brought is perfect, right? And yes, as imperfect people have to implement it. But the point is that with the solutions that we come up with, we can point to it's fair. You know, when I was discussing with a non-Muslim recently about this issue, it's like, why should the HST in Ontario be 13%, right? However, when you look at zakat as the Muslim ummah, when we say it's 2.5%, we know that it's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we know that it's not special interest groups or rich people who come up with that kind of this formula.
Yeah.
And it being an asset tax is also an issue, because that same, that report that you point out to, you know, that's what everyone's kind of pointing to. And I was like, what about asset taxes, right? And it's interesting because they mentioned if we have a 0.5% asset tax, I think it said mentioned about 130 million people would be pulled out of poverty and have a livelihood, right? So 0.5%, let alone put it to 2.5%.
So if I can, sorry to cut you off there. So basically, what you're talking about is, it's basically what Islam kind of instills as a redistribution of wealth. Like something like this would not happen, where a small minority own more than half of the human population with their wealth, right? Am I correct to say that? Yeah. So this, I mean, some people say, okay, well, it seems like, you know, it kind of like seems like a socialist economic system, right? I think that's what you're alluding to, probably, Brother Khurram.
Yeah, I actually wanted to know, maybe everybody here can shed light on that, is what is, as Brother mentioned, Islam calls for a fair economic system. What is that fair economic system like? And what's the difference between Islamic economic system and capitalism and communism? Right. What's the major difference?
Right. So, I mean, that's a great question, and it's one that we have to kind of set up, is that the capitalist and communist economic systems they're man-made systems. So that on that spectrum, they always go between left and right, right? So what I was trying to allude to earlier is that Islam doesn't neatly fit in one or the other, right? So on the one hand, Islam does not allow price controls, as I mentioned in that narration, but at the same time, it allows for the common ownership of wealth. So someone who would look at that superficially would say that, if you just look at the common ownership aspect, you would say, well, this is socialistic, right? Whereas if you would look at the lack of price controls, you'd say this is capitalistic, right? What I would say is that the primary difference is that, first of all, Islam looks to harness the natural productivity of people, and then what it does is that it ensures that there's a distribution of wealth automatically through the application of the rules, right? So a couple of the key things that distinguish it from capitalism is that as we know, is the prohibition of interest, and a little lesser known prohibition, which is the prohibition on stock markets. Right. So what this does is, when you look at the current system, what is one of the key mechanisms by which the wealth is concentrated and doesn't distribute is through the stock ownership. So, for example, if you look at someone like Tyson Foods, one of the ways that when Don Tyson was looking to expand his company, and he was someone who survived the Great Depression, and he was wondering as to how to do this because he was burning through his operating capital. And so what he decided to do was to do an initial public offering, right? So what he decided to do is to essentially buy out the market. And he actually says that. It's that this is an expand or expire strategy, where what he'll do is just acquire the competition, and thereby he's immune to the market, right? And so what has happened now is, because with capitalism, whether it's through bonds or stock or other what they call investment vehicles, essentially what happens is the big companies are able to buy out the market, and the market ceases to be something that governs people in general. Right. So what Islam effectively does, from an implication point of view, it prevents money from becoming an industry on its own. Right. And so this is its primary sort of distinguishment from capitalism when it comes to the what is called the capital markets. Essentially, through different ahkam, it abolishes those capital markets. And so therefore the rich person, when he's rich, he can only the way he can get richer is through either direct investment, where he invests in his own businesses, still being subject to the market. Going back to Don Tyson, is that he would, if he couldn't have done the IPO, then the chicken prices would have dictated how much wealth he had, right? Or what he would have to do is partner with other people, right? So he could do partnership structures, but the partnership structures would be equal footing. So if there's a rich person with all the wealth and a person with no wealth, an entrepreneur, when they come into the business, they both have equal say when it comes to that business, right? So just because he's the wealthy, he can't dictate all the terms, right? So there's a more equal footing. Now, of course, because he's wealthy, he definitely will have more say. But when it comes to the ijab and qabul, or the offer and acceptance, which goes into forming the company, just like in a marriage, the partner, which is called mudaraba, where there's a partner who has just a partner in body, doesn't have any wealth he puts in the business, he has a say. Now, what's interesting, what Islam does is, because really the rich person has no choice but to find the best entrepreneurs. So like you see like a good sort of approximation would be like something like Dragon's Den. I don't know if you've seen that show, where the rich people, like, they'll try to find entrepreneurs, right? Is that's the only place where they can get their money to grow. And one of the reasons they would do that is for self-interested reasons, because they know themselves are not the best people. There might be smarter people out there who know how to grow the money, right? So they'll have to partner on equal footing. They might be able, depending on the negotiation, how the profit gets split will depend on that, on who is better able to negotiate. But the point is that if they want their money to grow, they would have to search out the best entrepreneurs, and they'd be vying with the other people of wealth for those entrepreneurs, right?
Okay. So in other words, are you saying that Islam promotes some kind of a controlled capitalism kind of system? Can we say that, or would that be wrong?
I would say the way I say you have entrepreneurial system without capitalism, right? Because capitalism goes from an Aqidah perspective. They believe in the freedom of ownership, right? Whereas we do not believe in the freedom of ownership. We believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can tell us how to run the system, right? And so from an ideological perspective, if someone is a pure capitalist person, a thinker, would look at Islam, would not say this is capitalism, right? Just like a socialist person would look at Islam and say this is not socialism. Because we believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the owner of the wealth, for example, something even basic like that, takes us out of the fold of the secular thinking, where they don't uphold such things. Because on the other side of it, there is a distributive aspect of wealth. You see, like, with what's happening in the States, that even like a modest kind of wealth tax is seen as something that they're trying to fight. Like some of the politicians on the Democratic side of the fence are advocating for modest wealth taxes, and they're being fought because this infringes on their freedom of ownership, right? So they believe that when they have their wealth, don't touch the wealth. Let's talk about income taxes. Let's not talk about wealth tax, right?
Right. So on one hand, we have this spiritual aspect of the economic system where, as you mentioned it, everything is owned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we are trustees of that wealth. And then on the other hand, as I understand what you just said, it's more like a mixture of capitalism and communism. So you're taking the good aspects from both these systems. Is that true?
I wouldn't say that. It's that Islam stands on its own 2 feet, and I think that's very important. Is what I advocate, for example, is using the economic system as a way to invite non-Muslims to Islam, right? Because what it is that Islam, if there was no communism and capitalism, a jurist would come up with the same conclusions based on him studying the evidences, regardless of the environment. That is, in Islam, what the thinking leads the action, and we're not influenced by our environment, right? That the hadith and the Quran, all the things all the policies I'm advocating for are influenced by the texts themselves, not necessarily the environment. Like, we all know that interest is haram, right? But there's more to it than that. As I've talked to the brothers before. For example, we have the gold and silver standard, right? Which is something that's based on ijtihad, right? Which is based on the study of the evidences, right? So Islam does stand on its own 2 feet, and it's precisely because its power to build a consensus comes from the fact it's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Because as as I mentioned, that even though you and I are decent people and we don't want to do harm to people, if you and I sat down and tried to build a system that was beneficial to anyone, because of our limitations, we simply couldn't do that because we don't have foresight like that. Whereas Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who made the universe, who made us, made human beings, made men, women, made rich people, made poor people, made these concepts, He knows how to best to regulate our things. And that's the fact the solution comes from the text is what makes it makes it acceptable.
So I guess it would be safe to say that, because like in terms of formalization of communism and capitalism actually came after Islam, right? Because the Islamic system itself was already there and it was being practiced. So I think it would be incorrect. It would be kind of incorrect to say that. Okay, so later on when we look at the Islamic system, it's a combining or a mixture of communism and capitalism, which would be actually incorrect, because formalization of these two systems came later anyways, right? The Islamic system came beforehand, and it was actually practiced as well, successfully. I mean, one could look at it when we're looking at history.
Absolutely.
And I think this can kind of, we can lead into the next topic, which is, well, connected topic is, it's like, what is money? Like what is money in the Islamic system, or what is actually money? And I know you had written a paper, Brother Ali, on this. If you want to kind of elaborate on that.
Yeah, no, Shakla. Well, when we talk about the Islamic economic system, I mean, one thing we need to keep in mind is that we cannot talk about it in a vacuum, right? We can talk about what money is in Islam and what it's not, but at the same time, without the core implementation of the system in itself, it's not going to lead us anywhere. So kind of going back to your question, so money, as Brother Malik already mentioned, that, gold and silver, money in Islam essentially is anything which has intrinsic value to it, let it be a commodity or any minerals whatsoever, right? So that's essentially what money in Islam is. Whereas in the current system, which is based on the fiat currency system, which is completely antithetical to the Islamic, the monetary, policy. But you can probably delve a little bit more into it and talk about the gold and silver standard, right? And how it kind of relates to the Islamic economic system overall, and how it's the evidences and everything else for it.
Yeah, so the evidence for that, which is interesting, is that when it comes down to the normally, like in Islam, tools in general we can adopt from other kind of civilizations. So when it comes to like internet technology or other kind of technologies, it comes down to is that we can adopt other technologies. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is when it came to the monetary system, is one of the few times that what we can see or we can like kind of point to where the tool was specified in a sense in the Sharia. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, for example, like he ordered using the weights of Makkah, the people of Makkah. And what is interesting is that from the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam right to the fall of the Khilafah, and even till today, which I believe it's 4.2 grams is a dinar.
It's a dinar, yeah.
Yeah.
So, which is what I'm call. Yeah.
Yeah. So it has been a consistent standard, and I was reading some related work on that, and that the Muslims by Allah's permission never cheated the standard. Right? Yeah. Whereas, for example, the Romans, I think they had originally had for their gold coin, it had 8 grams, and they kept
debasing it. Yeah.
They kept debasing it. And what's interesting is that going back to this issue of hukum shari and the obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is that this is what kind of drives the Islamic society, right? And that's interesting that for 1400 years, when the Khilafah was still around, that even to the end of the days, it didn't cheat, even though it had economic situation. One of the things that led to the demise of the Ottomans was their inability to pay their debts. Mm-hmm. But they didn't cheat the standard, right? Which is interesting, is that even in our weakest of times, there still was this concept of taqwa.
That's interesting.
And that. So the other one evidence is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala condemns the prohibition of gold and silver and connects it to spending, right? Which points to that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to use as well as another evidence that this is the gold and silver standard, right? So then when we understand the hukam, we can see its brilliance, right? Yeah. Because when Allah directs our mind to the right under the right hukam and how to deal with the situation, it's one of the core things when we're trying to compare the capitalist economic system to the Islamic solutions, because that's what is plaguing us today is capitalism. Communism is dead. Alhamdulillah.
So what do you brothers think? And I think, Brother Khurram, you had shared this article with me where the Malaysian Prime Minister and I think leaders of these other few.
Yeah, this was the Kuala Lumpur summit where the leaders of Turkey, Malaysia, and Iran, they had attended. And one of the suggestions put forward by the Malaysian Prime Minister was maybe Muslims should consider trading, should consider barter trading as well as a gold and silver standard, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure how that works. What kind of barter system are they talking about? How will it work in the present context? And what's this gold and silver standard? Is it like we have foreign exchange reserves which are in dollars, so get rid of those dollars and then base it on gold and silver? Is that what it's talking about?
So I think we have to kind of separate two things. One is that when we look at these kind of rulers that are kind of exist, when they kind of come up with these solutions, is that they come up with a certain kind of political context, which is that they are coming from kind of point of view of where they play within the current system. Let's put it in a kindly, is that they play with within the UN, and when they destroyed the Ottoman state, the Khilafah state, and cut it up into the little pieces, and whether it's Turkey or Iran or these other kind of players, is that they're playing within that game, and and then we see that really the owner of those kind of situation is still the capitalist nations, right? So the recent assassination of the Iranian general, for example, it shows that as long as, when he was doing what needed to be done, according to the foreign powers, they were fine with what he was doing. But the moment he stepped out of the line, then he was finished. And we see that with other rulers as well, that, that if they get something, when they don't do what they're supposed to do, then the mechanisms of the control comes out, right? And so the only way for something of this magnitude to come back would be where you'd need an independent political entity that was capable of withstanding the pressure from especially the U.S. to stand on its own two feet. Even when the U.S., for example, abandoned the gold standard in 1971 under Nixon, it had the political capability of doing so and imposing that. One of the American officials told the Europeans, it's our currency, but it's your problem. Meaning that because they have all the firepower in the world at that time, the Europeans just had to deal with the fiat standard. Because the economists, even both on the American and the European side, were quite worried, because this is in previous kind of experiments, whether it was in France in the 18th century or in other places, the fiat standard didn't really work out because it's not intuitive, right? Like to have all this money, to kind of having, essentially giving the U.S. Printing press the Midas touch. They can just kind of flood the money with the money through the world. And I think that's partly why it survived so long, because it's just kind of floating outside into the peripheries of the empire, if you will. So going back to what the way it would work, you can't implement Islam in piecemeal. You can't just take the gold standard and then still have riba, for example, interest as a standard way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala designed the system, is to work in an ecosystem. All these laws have to work with each other, right? Mm-hmm. So you can't, for example, cut the hand of the thief if you don't have a policy that enables the fair distribution of wealth, right? So, people can see that injustice, that on the one hand, you're implementing essentially capitalism, but then at the same time, you're implementing the Islamic rules around that, and that, which actually forbids the cutting the hand of the thief in a famine, for example. So when you look at, if from a very practical perspective, for the gold and silver standard come back, none of the current Muslim countries would be able to kind of really put that forward in a way that was sincere, because if they were actually doing it in a sincere way, they would be quickly dealt with. And if we are serious about kind of making that a reality, then it has to have an independent political entity that kind of is able to kind of stand on its own 2 feet outside of the capitalist system.
Would it be fair to say that, like, for an initiative that, like, say, the leaders of Turkey and Malaysia, they're toying with this idea of only using barter and gold and silver, is like putting the cart before the horse? Is that a fair assessment to say? Because we can't just okay, we're going to do this, but we're not going to do the rest of the other requirements that is best for a full functioning system, right? Mm-hmm. For humanity, right? So they can see the value in, bartering or using gold and silver, because they have intrinsic value, as opposed to using paper money, which has no value. I guess this is the dilemma that most of the Muslim countries or people who want to do good are in. Would that be a fair assessment?
You've got is essentially how do we get where we need to go, right? Where we rebuild Islam, rebuild the honor and dignity of the Ummah, and have the ability to defend ourselves as an Ummah. And you're right. Like it's a good way of putting it is that what is the objective ultimately of this political entity in our countries, right? If they're not there to defend us as people, and to
what I've also noticed is like a lot of talk, no action. For example, as Brother Khurram, as you mentioned, based on that article where Malaysian Prime Minister says, okay, let's do this, but they won't even do it. Like they talk a lot. Okay, but imagine if they did. Like for example, Turkey and Malaysia and what other countries were? Iran, yeah. And so they decided, okay, they've made a pact, Iran, Turkey, and Malaysia, that we're going to only deal with gold and silver. And as you mentioned, if they're just focusing on that aspect, the powers to be will come down really hard on them. That's something that's foreseeable. What do you brothers think?
Well, I think a lot of the U.S. hegemony is based on the dollar. Right?
Yeah.
Like when you look at it from a logical point of view, again, outside of Islam, like it's actually a beneficial system to the U.S. If they wouldn't be able to outsource for example, their manufacturing to China, if they had to ship boatloads of gold and silver to China, because then China would acquire all the monetary, the medium of exchange physically, right? So it's advantageous for the U.S. to maintain the dollar standard, right? And this goes back to, again, the issue of taqwa, which is that the issue is that the reason why I implement these standards is because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best, right? Yeah. Even though like one could argue that this new political entity would benefit from that. So if these people were serious on trying to challenge that standard of the U.S., it's a pillar of the American imperial system, right? To have the dollar standard. So I can't see how they would tolerate that, or what game America was playing. If it was America was behind it, what game was it playing? So
and also if anything, since the Iranian Revolution, they had almost 50 years now, almost, 70 and plus 20, 50 years, 40-ish, right? So to actually implement the so-called Islamic economic system. So we kind of see where they're heading and what they've been up to for the past so many years now. So I think going back to your point, I think it's just to relate to the general public sentiment, which is changing in the Muslim world right now, I believe so, to kind of pacify the so-called quote-unquote Islamist, that we are working to revive the so-called Islamic way of life, however they define it, as per their own definition. So I think that's more of kind of keeping the sentiment in check. What do you think? Especially in those countries like Malaysia, especially Malaysia is the only country in the Muslim world which has spearheaded the Islamic banking. If it was really serious about implementing the Islamic economic system, they would not be going full speed into the Islamic banking arena, right? And Islamic banking is obviously a topic for another day, but essentially,
well, it actually is today's topic.
It equates to Islamic halal whiskey, right? Because with Islamic banking and everything else, you're obviously working within the same existing infrastructure, which is one of capitalism itself.
It was based on interest-based system. Yeah.
Absolutely,
debt-based interest.
Exactly. So you're actually creating and prolonging the system by having the so-called Islamic banks, because it's funny because a lot of even economists, even the Harvard grad economists, if you ask them about the creation of the money itself, they would be astonished. They would have no clue, right? How the fractional reserve banking, for example, works, how the fiat currency itself comes into existence, and how it operates, and how the foreign currency exchange works itself. So if they had all those years, right? It's because Malaysians started the Islamic banking concept back in the 70s as well. It was actually right after the Iranian Revolution in the mid 70s, and it was kind of fully supported by the Gulf states, because they needed some sort of an avenue to push their oil money, because they were getting all this US dollars, but at the same time they wanted to invest in some sort of a Sharia compliance products. So hence the system came into existence. So again, going back to square one, we can't really talk about implementing the gold and silver standard or talk about the Islamic economic system if we need a polity, which is implementing Islam or Sharia, in its full steam. Right? We can't do piecemeal.
Yeah, but I don't understand one thing. Even let's say if there is a polity as such that you guys are talking about, how would that polity work by itself? Shouldn't it be trading with other countries? They have their own system. So how will that work? How will that interaction take place?
Well, I mean, a lot of it will depend on how that how this entity would come into existence in today. And then I think that when these policies, when you kind of look at their magnitude and their impact on that, it would be that first kind of starting point as guided by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he was picking where to migrate to. One of the conditions was that political entity have to be self-sufficient, right? So it'd have to at least be able to provide from a kind of resource perspective for its population, at least from a food perspective. So, for example, like what would be a no-go? No offense to our brothers and sisters in Lebanon, but Lebanon is not a point where you could launch from, right? But on the other hand, we have the countries like Turkey and Pakistan who have, a substantial resource sector that could be reorganized in a very quick manner to fulfill the needs of the people from a basic needs perspective. Those would be the kind of starting points, because we could expect to have, boycotts and other kind of retaliatory measures imposed on such a political entity. So, in its birth, sort of in the birth kind of phase, when it's trying to struggle to get on its own feet, the first thing is to that taking some areas in a place like Syria or Lebanon would be a no-go, because it can't even defend itself. Whereas, a place like Pakistan, for example, would be an example of a place that could launch and defend itself. And so that would be the first point. But then quickly that state would have to, kind of bring the other Muslim territories under one flag, so to say, under the flag of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and to kind of keep on uniting the Ummah politically under this entity.
So in other words, it's probably, I think what you're trying to allude to is that in the infancy stage of this polity, when it comes to very existence, it has to have a capability of self-sustainability. Essentially, it has to be self-sufficient for the time being, and in its infancy stages. And then obviously, then you outgrow it, then you expand it, and bring other, Muslim, lands within its, under its flag, essentially, right? And then obviously, you have to have, when you talk about self-sufficiency and self-sustainability, you have to have enough resources within that polity, where you can actually have, trade, plus at the same time, food, resources, water, food, etc., that, you don't have to depend on the imports primarily. So you have to have enough stocks, or, you have to have, fertile lands within that polity, within the territorial boundary, where you can actually grow your own food for your population. So I think that's probably where you're leaning to, in the infancy stage, that needs to happen for maybe X number of months or years,
right,
before you actually start trading, with other nations. And then, again, it's, I think it's some sort of I think it's hard. I think I hear where you're coming from too. It's sometimes hard to kind of put into perspective when we look at the world today from a nation state perspective, and how the world existed, prior to the, nation state model we're finding ourselves in. For example, when you talk about the Prophet ﷺ, when he migrated from Makkah to Medina, right, it was a very much of a tribal system. So, there were imports, but at the same time, if you look at it, even the Romans and the Persians at that point in time were dealing in gold and silver standard, right? Gold standard came from denarius, which is the Roman currency of use, and the Persian currency was drachma, which is the silver dirham. So Rasulullah obviously brought in all these reforms, but at the same time, he kept the gold and silver standard, which was actually borrowed from the Romans and the Persians, at that point in time. So probably the complexity of implementing or reviving the Islamic way of life, it's obviously a little bit more involved, a little bit more complex, and, a lot of intricacies involved, versus, how it was 1400 years ago. Would you agree with that, or?
Well, I think it's there's obviously more to it today, because the way how I would say, to your point, is that the way the Arabian Peninsula at the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was not integrated into the Roman or the Persian empires, respectively, right? Whereas our countries today are deeply integrated into the capitalist economic system. because just the way how capitalist imperialism works, right? And so the question is how do we untangle ourselves? It's a much more complex kind of process, because it would say it's a much more, tricky process, right?
Yeah.
Because all eyes are on us, right?
Exactly.
You know what I mean? When you have reports like being put out by RAND, Civil Democratic Islam, which talk to how they're going to divide and conquer us, right? Or call, label our love for one another a disease, calling it Ummah. It's like they're planners in Washington D.C., London, and France, and other places on how to keep us down, right? Whereas the Persian and the Romans didn't care so much for the Arabs, right? Because they saw them as
they're left alone,
backward people, and Allah gave them cover, and that's how the first Islamic state came to be.
Yeah, I just want to mention, but the questions that Brother Khurram has posed, these are very important questions, because all this needs to be laid out. Like, if we're advocating that Islam offers, like, in terms of the best system for both Muslims and non-Muslims on this planet, and in terms of, and also in this case, in this context, we're talking about the economic system, right? All these intricacies need to be laid out in kind of like, implementing all this, right? So it's a very important question, because as you said, and as everyone here is alluding to, is that the world has been cantonized, right, with this nation-state system, the secular capitalistic nation-state system, right? And this has affected the Muslims in the world as well. Like, our minds have been colonized, hence decolonizing minds. That's our attempt, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So this is an attempt to kind of decolonize all our minds, and kind of get outside this framework that we're subject to, and see, what is there a better alternative? Islam is just not all rituals, but it actually offers the best system for humanity, right? So all that needs to be laid out. But this is very interesting. We have to look at a place where it's the most fertile to be first independent in the beginning, and then we can look at trading. Is that what you're kind of alluding to? Like, that's something that will need to be done, or
Well, so I want to get back to Khurram just to kind of see what do you think in terms of that, because what I think what we're talking about to the brother's point is that what we're talking about is providing an alternative to humanity, right? As, like, for example, I know it seems kind of strange, like, let's say, to have this kind of vision, but for example, like, these what we see happening to the Hispanic people in the southern border. But I think part of our vision for Khilafah is for them as well. Like, what they're doing, this brutal, inhumane policy where they separate the children from their mothers. The birth of this alternative, we could tell those people, if America doesn't take you, we'll take you. That's the kind of paradigm that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and through His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam taught us, that we're not here just for the platform of Islam, which allows non-Muslims to live within it and to worship according to their own beliefs, is something that's for all people, and that's why it's such a very stark vision, differential vision than what we have offered today. So I think that's where I'm coming from. So I just want to kind of clarify that.
I think one of the challenges that we face today is how this Khilafah system has been smeared by, let's say, some of our own misguided people.
Sure.
And how that has been projected in the Western media, right? So in those times, there was the age of empires, right? So people were colonizing lands, they were attacking lands, they were conquering lands. This is the age of, I would say, it's the war of ideologies, right? So you have capitalism, you have communism, and now communism, I think that was in Soviet Union sometime in the 1990s when that was, when communism died down. You have capitalism and a vicious form of capitalism. And you're seeing the inequality in the world, right? Even the Western scholars, they're sick and tired of capitalism. The Western progressive scholars. But their saying is, what should we replace it with?
Right.
Even people are looking for an alternative, even in the West. So I think it's a good opportunity to provide that alternative, but in a sensible manner. What makes sense to even people who are not Muslims, right? And the way to go is providing an ideology which would help uplift the people's socioeconomic system.
So what I would say is that, I agree with you 100%, is that what I feel is that one of the challenges of doing dawah in our current times, to your point, especially because of the what Fukuyama called the end of history, I'm sure you've heard of, is that this idea that capitalism is won and everyone else is a loser, right? With the fall of communism, and as you said, and so what I kind of use is that what I find difficult when raising the issue of Islam with non-Muslims is that they see the akhirah and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as irrelevant, because that's what their creed teaches them, right? Is that God and Santa Claus or whatever it is that they're learning, is that something that is all just lies, and let's just talk about dunya, right? This is sort of the one way of describing the capitalist sort of belief system. And so what I find is that as you said, that and I found the same thing, is that even working in circles of the CPA profession, for example, the CA profession, is that you find a receptive ear to discuss what is the alternative to capitalism. And so I find that what the Islamic economic system enables you to do is to show how what people feel is wrong, there is an alternative. So, kind of to lay out the alternative as we were kind of discussing and go into deep discussions about it. But ultimately, the goal is then to talk about the Islamic Aqidah, right? So what I mean by that is that to make the case for submission. Because what I find is that the economic system, what it does is that it enables you to make the case that, well, look, the rich people have to submit to the system, right? Like if they want to, they have to submit, we all have to submit to the system. And it makes that case, regardless of the issue where you're discussing, whether it's social aspects, like for example, family aspects, which a lot of people object to about how Islam deals with that. You're making the case for submission in sort of the economic sphere, but then you can kind of, move it over to the other spheres. And so it kind of gives you a way to then talk about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his messenger in a way that,
exactly.
That's
right. So how you combine, the social economic aspect of things with the religious aspect.
Yeah.
And I think that's very important. That's the area we should focus on. How do we combine these things?
That's right.
It's not about saying, let's come up with an independent polity and I might call it wishful thinking. You might disagree with me, but let's be realistic. How do we carry this forward? And the only way I see it is through an ideology that works for people, because if you look even in the West, even Western scholars, they're talking about economic equality. That's a commonality, right? Because in Islam, we talk about economic equality. We talk about redistribution of wealth, right? In the West, they talk about redistribution of wealth. So you have these commonalities. Why don't we build on these, right? And then, as you said, combine it with the religious aspect as well, because I'm also part of dawah. I do dawah with some of the brothers. I do dawah in my office whenever I find time. What I see is there is a vacuum, a spiritual vacuum.
Right.
And people also wanna come out of that darkness.
Absolutely.
But they don't see the light.
Right.
Because nobody's there to show them the light. Right.
100%.
So I think we as Muslims, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has showed us the light, we need to show the light to those who do not have that light. Right? So
I think there's two things. One is that in terms of being realistic of how this entity is going to come out, like we just have to follow the path of the Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? Like we have to, because I think part of it is to look, look at what he did from a political lens. What I mean by that is taking the affairs of people, right? Is that we often, sometimes the way we learn about Islam in the khutbahs and the masajid and the Islamic schools is that, well, this Islam, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the Sahaba were great characters, and they had great character and they had great akhlaq, and this is what we look at, and we just kind of focus that without realizing the magnitude of what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam achieved by becoming a leader in Medina, right? That is no small feat. like it's, I mean, and I would put probably the blame on the Ummah first, but the people don't look to the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam as a way of acquiring power peacefully. For example, they'll talk about Gandhi, they'll talk about Martin Luther King, even though those things were not complete capture of power, as Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam captured the power. And without firing, if you will, a bullet, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam achieved that power. And I think that we can kind of delve into that for the sort of the nuggets as to how these policies will get into authority. Because he, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, despite being the best of all creation, when he was in Makkah, maybe a couple hundred people listened to him, right? But when he became a person of power and he achieved that power, then people started listening to him. With the whole Arabian Peninsula coming under his authority, right? Just before he, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, passed away. So I think that, I think that's another discussion. But going back to what you're saying about the issue of dawah, I think, like I totally agree that this is something that kind of speaks to a way of combining what we're saying into a cohesive message.
Exactly.
Because what most people, for example, don't know is that there's a suicide epidemic happening in Canada right now, for example, where you have the second largest cause of death for people 11 years of age and 29 years of age being suicide. Right? And that comes from not knowing your place in the universe, right? And that comes from not addressing that issue. And I think that what I promote is the issue of showing people and having discussions with people around the economic sphere, and then kind of taking it to that level so then you can cover all things, right? It's not just about trying to make Islam into something that it's not. Islam is a comprehensive system. It doesn't just look at human beings as an economic aspect and then a spiritual aspect separately. It looks at human beings as a cohesive whole.
Right.
Yeah, so I just want to mention, it's interesting in your dawah activities, you talk about the economic system. That's a way to kind of get them to kind of convince them what Islam is all about, right? In terms of submission to the Creator, right? When I do that, I take up a direct approach. So I actually kind of demonstrate that there is a Creator, logically speaking. So I take a very systematic approach. And once I point out that, okay, they're convinced of a Creator, logically speaking, and then you say, okay, well, the Quran makes that claim that it's a guide from that very Creator that you acknowledge that you logically exist. And then from there, all the other kind of systems that are there for, that are from the Creator for humanity's betterment, then that's the approach I take. I know everyone has different styles of doing dawah, so,
but just to clarify, is that just, what I'm saying is that, I use the economic system as a way to engage people at work, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Like, to sense people who are disaffected, right? Because if you're fine and satiated, and you're not seeking solutions, then how are you going to talk about things if you don't have problems, right?
Yeah.
So, and I totally agree with the direct approach if that becomes open to you. Like if someone suddenly starts talking about, is there a God, then you should definitely use the direct approach, right?
Yeah.
But to be honest, like for example, the person I'm talking to right now, and then we spent some early time talking about the economic system, but now it's all focused on the proofs, right? Like, does all exist? Do we need to listen to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and what is the proof of Quran? So I think that the point is it's just a means to get to that, because it's not to sell Islam on benefits and say, hey, we're going to get rid of interest. You're not going to have, you're going to get rid of corrupt politicians. So come on board, because Islam is,
or it's going to satisfy your feeling of the poor being taken care of, and et cetera, right?
Rich people, no one's going to take your head because there's security in the streets, right?
And I don't know if you've sensed it or not. Nowadays, I see there's like, I can sense that people are against interest. They don't want to pay this much interest anymore. They're against this interest-based system.
Yeah, 100%. I was talking to youth, and he was saying that the biggest source of malaise amongst people like in their mid-20s right now is this insurmountable debt, right? So when you have politicians talking about how they're going to get rid of debt and all that, it's speaking to this giant sense of looming, right? Because it's exponential growth rates, right? And how can a transaction that grows exponentially without a link to reality be sustainable, right? Even like when the Babylonians used to practice interest when the prince would become the king, they would cancel the debt because or in the Romans they had their jubilee where they would cancel the debt because they knew the interest was not sustainable, right? And this is what people are hitting right now is that, and it's kind of covered by the fact we have the fiat standard where they can just keep printing more money, quantitative easing, use all these fancy terms, right? It's like these things kind of cover it up, but the check's going to come due, if you pardon the expression.
Yeah. Just to kind of just qualify what Brother Khurram had mentioned, that like, non-Muslims who are well-read on the economic and monetary system, they realize the total crime of an interest-based system. And you probably realized that, Malik, when we did that seminar on towards a just monetary system. You guys remember we had some non-Muslims there as well from the Committee on Monetary and Economic Reform movement, who are there for to get rid of the interest-based system as well. So it's another way of kind of making connections with these non-Muslims who do see the utter breakdown of the system and doing dawah to them, right? Yeah. So, but anyways, go ahead, brother. Ali, you had to mention something.
I mean, I'm just kind of like qualified as well that we can talk about these systems you were talking about. That this is a wishful thinking. I think I beg to obviously differ, right? What I say is that system itself, the Islamic system, Islam itself is a comprehensive way of life. It needs to be implemented somewhere, to show it as a model for others to either come under it or imitate it or be part of it, right? So that needs to happen, obviously, in the Muslim world first. Right now, obviously, we have the whole planet and we don't even have an inch square where Islam in its full comprehension, has been implemented, right? So again, it's not a piecemeal. We were talking about that before too. We cannot implement or talk about these things. Yeah, it's great when you talk to non-Muslims about economic system, but right now it's all theoretical, right? There's no implementation of it. If there will, if I was, if I was a non-Muslim, my first question back to you would be, okay, do you have a implementation of it somewhere, right? Like, not in the textbooks or not in the history books, right? Show me where it has been implemented and it's actually working. Then okay, maybe I'll trust you, right? So that's also a dilemma as well. So I think kind of going back to square one that, okay, we need to kind of clean up our house first, right? And have the Islamic, Sharia implemented somewhere in the Muslim world where we can, show these systems, the economic system, the social system, the political system, the foreign policy, the judiciary system, all these systems working, as a well-oiled machine, for others to imitate, implement, or become part of it. So, I mean, you probably would notice that too in your dawah efforts too, right? These kind of questions probably do come up.
Well, to be fair, like the work to make this a reality is essentially this type of work, right? Like, which is to convince that the ummah that this is practical. So, I mean, to be fair to your comment, is that if once the ummah sees this as realistic, it'll happen. Right. It's that part of that is and a lot of this is to draw on the Islamic concepts of taqwa and having tawakkul in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but like taking it and making it into something that kind of operates in the political sphere as opposed to, just, I lost my job, so I should have tawakkul, right? Which is obviously you should have tawakkul at that point. But the point is that these concepts really came into when you look at the issue of, even like this last ayah of Surah Baqarah when Allah says to make our feet, steadfast against the disbelievers, right? Like the point was that when we look at the Quran and we look at the Anbiya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we see that the clash happened in the political realm, right? And one of I was giving a talk recently, I was talking about Musa alayhi salam going after Fir'aun. Like when we look at what the request of Musa alayhi salam, and we're kind of look at it from a 21st century lens or a 20th century lens, he's asking for the balance sheet of Fir'aun, right? So it's like, if you could imagine like, someone going into, and you don't have to imagine too much, but going to like, into America and say, give me all your slaves. The slaves in the time of the Civil War, they're worth about $1 billion, right? At that time, that money at that time. And so when Musa alayhi salam went to Fir'aun and said, I want all your slaves, it's like this clash happens. It doesn't seem realistic that Fir'aun is going to give it, right? But this is where that point comes where where that we, as those who follow the Anbiya, would have to have these kind of concepts when it comes to challenging these kind of systems, especially because of where the rubber hits the roads are our own countries, like in Muslim countries, where we have to convince those structures to switch sides, right? And to convince whether it's the army or the tribes, depending on the area, we have to convince them to switch sides and support Allah and His Messenger, and draw on what the Sahaba and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did in the road to Medina, if you will, to do that.
Yeah, but I think I'm learning a lot from this discussion. What I'm maybe thinking is, when we talk about a polity, right, basing it on the Islamic system of our deen, of our way of life, what comes to my mind is we need to be in a state of Islam before we talk about that kind of polity. And if I look around the Muslim countries, unfortunately, I don't see that kind of thing happening. People are working for their interests, states are working for their interests, rulers are working for their interests. Some are based even on un-Islamic kind of, governance or whatever you may call it.
Lifestyle. Yeah.
Lifestyles. Yeah. But I agree with Brother Malik that the message needs to be cohesive, right? Especially in the West where we live. It's very important that we provide or we present a cohesive message. What the spiritual side is, what the social side is, what the economic side is. Not just like when you talk about Christianity, it's just the Pope who, issues the fatwa and then everybody has to follow. That doesn't work in Islam, right?
No,
it's not based on that system.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
So what I think is interesting about this method that kind of adopted is that it's universal with both Muslims and non-Muslims, right? Is what I'm kind of advocating for, is that because part of the problem is that people within the Ummah is like a crisis of confidence in Islam, right? Is that
exactly?
You know what I mean? So I think for me, it's just whether I don't change my message that much. It's just a question of where in the conversation you're at with a person. So I think it's whether we're directing our microphones, if you will, or megaphones to the Muslim world or the megaphones to the Muslims or the non-Muslims here in Canada. It's essentially the same sort of kind of comprehensive vision that you have, right? And I can't emphasize enough that the mindset of the Ummah as it is in the Muslim world will not change unless we go talk to them, right? So it's like just as we're going to talk to non-Muslims, it's the same type of discussion that happens. It's just that with the Muslims
I agree with you.
Right? Yeah, it's just we have the Islamic Aqidah as a sort of a background, but we have to, one thing that I just want to kind of point out and, leave it to you guys where you want to direct it to is that really the Muslim world is more progressed intellectually than, if you can believe, than the West is, because they come up with much more kind of ways to divert the Ummah away from these kind of things, and they're active. And that's what I was referring to earlier. You can look at the Rand Corporation as sort of just one aspect of it, is that they work heavily on trying to divide and conquer us and to offer false alternatives. Like I would say, this kind of thing, as Ali alluded to earlier, was that to kind of offering these false starts of look at this gold and silver standard that these three countries are going to offer, and that they try to divert the Ummah away from these with these false movements and things like that. And I think that's why it takes a lot of effort to kind of bring back people to the movement of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and sticking to the haqq and away from that, and to have that as a thing, because it's quite challenging. And then if you're doing that in Pakistan or these other countries, it's not just these other kind of diversion tactics. The problem is the countries against you as well, with the intelligence services coming after you. So it's a long struggle, and we have to direct the megaphone both ways, is what I would say.
You want to add something? Okay. Yeah. So, Jazakallah khair for that, Brother Malik, Jazakallah khair, Brother Khurram and Ali. I think with that, this is obviously, we can go into another part on this discussion, but we just got some limited time here, so we'll be ending it. Anything, parting thoughts, anyone wants to share?
So I would say that the reason that I like coming on this show is that I'm not sure if Brother Khurram agrees. I'm guessing he will. Is that I think that the message here is that anyone watching this has to go and act, right? That we're not like I'm an activist and I call other people to activism. Is that I do have my blog, and if anyone's interested, definitely get touch.
Yeah, well, it'll be on the video page as well. So yeah,
Zishan or myself to say how you can do this. Is that no one is born a dawah carrier. We all have to work at it, and it's hard to get started, but we have to do this work. Because this is the work of the Sahaba and the Anbiya.
Yeah, being a Muslim is a verb, right? So, yeah, definitely. Well, Jazakallah khair, everyone, for listening. Assalamu alaikum.